Hello, you all. Welcome to the second week of this course, but the first lecture of this course. We are going to be doing it on pages 3 through 19 in the textbook. You are responsible to read the rest of the chapter, so page 20 through page 38. That is how this class is set up. So if you go to the syllabus under the topics for class column, that is what we'll be talking about in this format. And then whatever's in the reading or the homework section, that is what you are responsible to do on your own. I will still weave in some of the topics that are covered in the textbook only in our lecture as well. So you will have both. But you are responsible of in knowing um, both aspects, the lecture videos and the textbook. I'm drawing straight from the textbook too. Okay. So this is small group communication, and we're looking at the myths of communication. And I am your professor, Professor Wilson. So let's go ahead and get started. We do have a couple of reminders to go over. We'll do that actually at the end of this lecture. Then we do have an activity or comprehension check. For the activities, I do and formulate those in lecture in the context that we are actually in person. Obviously, we are not in person, but I do have another class that's on campus. So I like to structure the lectures in that format. So for the activity, when we get to that section, I'll have you answer on your own and try to ask maybe your friends and family these questions just so you can still have that interactive aspect. Then we're going to go over the myths, and then we are going to have some discussions. Again, this would be leading into our discussion board on Canvas. So those questions under the discussion period will be on the discussion board. Okay, so some lesson objectives. By the end of this lesson, we will understand the myths of communication through guided conversation. By the end of this lesson, we will define what communication is through an activity. And then by the end of this lesson, we will discuss general ways to achieve communication competence through a group discussion. Okay, for starters, true or false? Individuals in groups often do not think that they contribute a lot to group projects, meetings, and or discussions. So go ahead and take a second, decide on your own if that is true or if that is false. The answer is false. So individuals and groups often do think that they contribute a lot to group projects, meetings, discussions, despite the fact that they often are not. So what we're looking at here is most of the time we think we add in a lot of contributions to group presentations and group discussions and group projects. But in actuality, we often don't do that. We often don't contribute enough. And this is for the general population. So you might individually contribute a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, for everyone that is involved in group discussions or communication, don't contribute enough. True or false? Individuals who purposely do not participate in group discussions, projects, or communication are subconsciously influencing others to do the same. Individuals who purposely do not participate in group discussions, projects, or communication are subconsciously influencing others to do the same. That is true. And these individuals are called social loafers. So individuals who they think that they are okay with not contributing to a group project, for example, because it's only their grade, so no one else is going to be impacted, when in actuality, it's the whole group. So by doing that, though, by having that mindset, they're influencing others to take their actions. Just because we as humans tend to gravitate towards things that are negative, and our human nature is to be negative. We like to say and hear the word no. Okay. Okay, so group work, group meetings, projects are time consuming and unproductive. True or false? Group work, group meetings, projects, etc. are time consuming and unproductive. Is that true or is that false? The answer is true, actually. A lot of executives report feeling trapped by such meetings. So then, why do we have this class? Nonetheless, why do we have this class for 16 to 17 weeks? Seems like it might be a waste of time, right? And I understand that sentiment, but the reason why we need this class is because we need effective communication. Okay, so we're going to explore what effective communication is. So, again, this is in the context of the in-person class, but on your own, go ahead and come up with 5 to 8 ideas of what you believe effective communication constitutes. What makes communication effective, right? 6 or 5 to 8 ideas of what you believe makes communication effective. And what I want you to do is I want you to email me those in an email and put the activity title that you see here, so activity, what is effective communication, and then send me your ideas. Okay? Okay. So let's go over the myths of communication. So the first myth is that communication is a cure-all. So what this word or what this phrase or statement means is that we as humans believe that communication is going to cure everything that's ailing us, curing everything in society. And that unfortunately is not the answer. That is not the magical answer. The phrase communication is key is true. However, it's the key to open the door. They never tell you about what happens after you open the door, right? So it is the key to opening the door to new horizons or to new ideas, but it's not the one singular thing that is going to create peace or bridge barriers or items like that. It's not going to cure all of our woes. Okay. Another myth is that communication can break down. So the idea here is that we believe that as humans, communication can never be misunderstood. It can never break down. And that is a myth. As we have all experienced, humans continue to communicate even when they may not want to. How many times have you been sitting across from someone and they make a face that you interpret as them being super annoyed, when in actuality, they're probably thinking about something else, or they're probably not trying to communicate that they're annoyed, but that is the what we're receiving from their facial expression, right? So it can break down. There can be misunderstandings, and we're going to learn a little bit more about this element later on in this lecture in the second part, okay? Effective communication is skill building. So the idea, this myth is saying that you can build skills to be better at communication. And while that is technically true, it's not a way to build effective communication. And the reason why is because there are no amount of skills that will be meaningful for it to be effective, and actually it might actually be harmful. And again, we're going to explore this a little bit more later in the second part of this lecture. Effective communication is common sense. That's a huge myth. My idea of what effective communication is not going to be the same as the next person. My idea of how I'm communicating with someone else isn't going to be well received by someone else who thinks that I'm doing something else by communication, or if I'm coming off too strong, or if I'm coming off too direct or rude or angry or sad or whatever the case may be. It's not common sense. There's so many different layers that go into communication that every time you communicate with someone, there may be a mixed signal that is being sent. Okay. So learning communication requires a degree of humility, a willingness to recognize and address our shortcomings. So the idea here is like give this person all the communication that we want to give them. But sometimes there's some shortcomings, and we need to be willing and humble enough to address that shortcoming. We could be like, hey, sorry, I thought I was communicating clearly. That is okay. You're addressing it to the person that you thought you were communicating the plans. Let's say you're having some weekend plans with your friends. You thought you were communicating your plans to your friends perfectly, but they might have interpreted it a different way, right? And being okay with the mistakes, but also being able to address and admit the mistakes is what we're looking at here. Okay, so let me pull up the second part. So now we're looking at defining communication. So we went over what communication's not, and now we're going to be talking about what communication is. Okay, we're going to work on defining communication as best as we can. Some learning objectives for today. We will define what communication is through a guided group discussion. Again, this will be on our discussion board. We will compare and contrast the differences between verbal and nonverbal communication through an activity. And then we will build our understanding of communication through a video example. Okay. Okay, so the agenda for today is we're going to go over transactional communication. We're going to go over this idea of communication being a process. Then we're going to go over an idea of communication being a sharing meaning process. We're going to go over verbal, nonverbal communication. We're going to talk about interconnectedness, and then we're going to talk about the communication environment. So let's go ahead and get started. So this is an activity that I want you to do on your own, and I want you to do the same thing that you did in the earlier email. So put this in an email to me. The phrase communication is a process. What does that mean to you? If someone came up to you and said that communication is a process, what do you think that means? What could that possibly mean? Okay, so I want you to think about that. Put it in that email. If you've already sent that previous email, that's totally fine. But send it in an email. I want to know what you're thinking when I say communication is a process. So most of the time when you ask a communication professional like myself, or maybe I should say, if we were transported back into the past about 20 to 30 years ago, if you ask a communication professional about what communication is, they would have given you a very archaic, a very old way of looking at communication. And now that I said that, I just realized that it's not 20 to 30 years ago because I wouldn't have been born. So it was more, or I would have been born. So we're looking actually more like 40 to 50, which is so gross, but 40 to 50 years ago, this is the model that we as communication professionals were thinking that communication is. We thought of communication as being a sender process. So the process of communication was thought of as being started by the sender. When the sender has chosen a meaning, they encrypt the message and choose a channel to send it through to the recipient. Okay, that's a lot. And it doesn't really give you much, except for there's someone that is thinking something and it's encrypting that message, going through the code meaning the syntax of, like, let's say I like hamburgers, your mind's formulating that statement to be sent through a channel, and a channel does not mean your TV channel. It does not mean your YouTube channel. It means this method of giving this information to something else. Again, this is very archaic, to another person. Okay. And that's the receiver. So the receiver decodes, interprets, and responds to the message of the sender. The receiver may be an individual or a group. The receiver of the message gives the original sender a response or feedback. So think of it this way. The way we thought of communication was how we do instant messaging or text messaging. We formulate something to send, we send it to that person reads it, they type something back, and they send a response. That is how we thought of communication as. And luckily, and thank goodness, we have changed our minds about that because we were kidding ourselves. It's not a linear process. It's not a process where I send a text message and that means I am the sender and then my friend is the receiver. Because what if that friend sends me a different question? Now the roles are flipped. But also, I, when I'm talking to someone in person, again, non-verbally, I am getting code from them. If I'm talking, like if when I'm talking to person, you guys, and if you were here in person, you'd be making facial expressions. And that is a code coming back to me. So I can't be just the sender, I'm also the receiver. So it's a process that goes back and forth consistently. It's not something that's stagnant. It's not something saying, oh, I'm the sender, you're the receiver. That's just ludicrous. That's not how communication works. And it's never worked that way. So let's look at some other things that we talked about. We talked about the channel. So let's look at the medium first. So the medium is a system of communication used in the communication process. It is the method by which the message is delivered between the sender and the receiver. Print, mass media, electricity, and digital are mediums. So if we're going to use our Zoom space here, Zoom is our medium. I'm giving you information. It's being put into this video and it's going to be put onto Canvas for you all to see. So Zoom is acting as the medium for me to communicate this information to you. Now, Canvas is the channel. So a message can be delivered to its target audience using a communication channel. Examples of communication channels include phone calls, text messages, emails, videos, radio, and social media, etc. So Zoom is our medium here. The way that I get this to you is through Canvas, or in our case, is through YouTube. That's where our lectures are going to be posted. So that is the medium and the channel. And we didn't add the medium and the channel until 20 to 30 years ago. So we had the sender receiver model about 40 to 50 years ago, got the channel and the medium about 20 to 30 years ago. Okay. So obviously there's more nuance to this, right? There's more things that are involved in this communication process. This can't be just all of it, right? And you are right. There's something called the noise. So this is where in communication, noise is anything that stops a receiver from fully comprehending a message. Noise can be external and internal, and it can disrupt communication anytime. So this person, this demographic or this infographic I have right here, the person sleeping, they're supposed to be on the computer. That's why they're at the computer. But the headphones are not allowing them to fully comprehend a message that's coming through because it's blocking from them to see, and the sleeping also, because they're supposed to be listening to whatever's happening on the computer. The sleeping is disrupting them from fully comprehending the message coming from the computer. Okay. So think of this also as when, you know how when you're dropping someone off or trying to find somewhere in your car that you've never been before, we usually, from what I've experienced, we usually all go to turn down the radio so we can see better, usually at night, right? We turn down the radio for some reason for us to be able to see where exactly we're going. And that's the noise. It's the thing that's disrupting you from really comprehending a message. If you ever had like a coffee date at a coffee shop and the baristas are just going, always using machines, it can be pretty loud. And that can affect how you hear that person you're talking to, right? So that is the noise. For the feedback, this is the reaction or response of the receiver. It provides insight into how the receiver interprets and understands the message of the sender. So this feedback process is very much used in therapy, in talk therapy, where the therapist is talking to you, asking you questions, and you might verbally state something. Your body language says something else. And usually they're able to pick up on that, especially if they're a good therapist. They'll be able to pick up on the body language shift and be able to be like, okay, did you really mean that? And this is how mothers know that you're lying because your body language changes when you're lying. And kids are usually not really good at lying for the most part. So that's the feedback. So these are all part of the communication process. And then there's also context. So context is the collection of observable conditions that both the sender and the receiver can use to associate the same elements with a specific message. Excuse me. These are interconnected factors that can have an impact on the message. Physical, psychological, social, cultural aspects are among the communication contexts that need to be considered in the communication process. And we'll talk about this in just a few seconds here. So for our context in small group communication, we have these things called a content dimension and relationship dimension. The content dimension is how information is transmitted. The relationship dimension is how messages define or redefine the relationship. So if you ever had a boss and you're in a group meeting, and normally the conversations that you and your boss have interpersonally are way different than how well, sometimes they are, but for the most part, in a professional setting, that interpersonal relationship is different in the context of the small group communication. If your manager was to bring in another coworker or maybe their manager into a meeting with you, that dimension, that relationship dimension is going to change. It's going to redefine how we interact in that communication. Okay, so I keep saying that communication as a process. So let's define that a little bit more. So communication as a process is really looking at the changes in events and relationships as a part of a continuous flow or process. So it's not stagnant, it's not set in stone, it's not a clear start, and it's not a clear end. It's continuous, right? Think of this as teachers and students, so you and me. If you were in my in-person class, your thoughts about me as a professor at the beginning of the semester will probably change by the end of the semester. Okay, either good or bad. Usually it's good from my experience, but could be bad, right? And these events through this whole semester and this relationship that we build as a student teacher dynamic might change based off of how we communicate and how we get to know each other, right? Real quick, but going back, so teachers and students. So if we were in person, the way that we are communicating to each other in person, it's going to be a little bit different in that format compared to this format because you'll be able to see my full body. You'll be able to see my full body expression. You'll be able to, the lighting might be different in that room, and the environment that you're in when you're in the classroom might be different than when you're sitting here on your laptop or whatever device you're viewing this lecture on. Communication as sharing meaning. So what we're looking at here is sharing ideas, feelings, ruminations, experiences with others is part of the process of constructing meaning, of determining connections and patterns in our mind, of making sense of our world. So one way that teachers, for example, can and professors can get better at getting through to their students to make sure that they're able to understand the material is by getting to know them. And that's where we're sharing this meaning. And by getting to know you all, I'll be able to make sure the message is getting across, make sure that our culture differences don't separate our meaning making, right? So you might be thinking at this point, how does one quote unquote do communication? And I think the answer is pretty obvious, but just in case, we do it verbally and non-verbally. So we do both, and that's the part of the process. Okay, so verbal communication. So we're looking at language here. And language is referred to as a structured system of symbols for sharing meaning. A structured system of symbols for sharing meaning. We also have symbols. So symbols was in the definition for language, right? So symbols are representations of referents. So whatever that symbol refers to is a referent. So a symbol is a representation of that referent. And we'll get into some examples as well. So meaning is in the mind of the beholder. You know how we always hear that beauty is in the mind of the beholder? Well, meaning is in the eyes of the beholder, in the mind of the beholder. And here's an example that might cement this idea. Why do our feet smell, but our noses run? Think about that. Why do our feet smell, but our noses run? So if you have stinky feet, why are we saying that my feet smell, even though those are two different body parts? And then why, when we're sick, perhaps our nose is running, even though running is saved and reserved for your feet? Two different areas of the body, right? But there's a correlation in our language, in our symbols that we use to describe this phenomenon of our feet smelling and our nose running. And we are able to make a sentence like that because we have a common agreement. If our feet have a particular scent to them that isn't flattering, we would say that our feet smell, even though our nose is up here and our feet are down there. And if we're sick and there's stuff coming out of our nose, we would say it's running because it's running down your face. But running is saved for feet. But because we have this common language, we have these symbols that we have agreed upon, and we meaning society, not you and me, but society before we were born decided that these terms meant what they meant in this context. Okay. And of course, there's going to be room for misunderstandings. Words are ambiguous, right? Words are also cultural. And we have this process of bypassing. So, bypassing is when you assume that everyone in the group has the same meaning for a word. So, here's a great example. I'm originally from Los Angeles, okay? The way that Los Angeles is structured is we have the Palos Verdes Peninsula on the south, right by the ocean. Then we have this inward curve, like a crescent, like that. Okay. That's has cities and counties where I'm from and water. And then on the northern part, we have the Santa Monica Mountains. And it forms this peninsula on this side. So we have a crescent here and then water in the middle. We, as humans, would call that a bay, right? We refer in Los Angeles as that area as the South Bay because there's a bay in San Francisco. Now, you all up here, it's at Sierra College, are usually from this area. So if someone said to you that they were from the Bay, you would think San Francisco Bay. But if someone like me, who moved up here from Los Angeles, heard you say that, we would think that you were talking about the South Bay. Okay. So there's misunderstandings because words are ambiguous. There's misunderstandings because words are cultural, just like how even in California, that one phrase has different cultural meanings. And then also bypassing. We all assume that if we're up in Northern California, if someone says the Bay, we all assume that we all know that the word is referring to the San Francisco Bay, but it's not because there's other people here from other cultures and other parts of California and the world. So we can't assume that. And that is where we get into a lot of issues. So let's move on to nonverbal communication. So nonverbal communication is the sharing meaning with others without using words, without using ambiguous language. So this, we're looking at facial expressions, eye contact, personal appearance, tone, etc. We're looking at mirroring versus competing. So mirroring is when group members tend to copy postures from others in the group. So if you, for example, saw someone running in a crowd, your first instinct might be to then start running because running usually means that there's danger, right? That's an innate human characteristic that we all have. If we see someone else running, we might start running. Some of us, like me, will be like, first, like, why are they running? And then we'd be like, we're freaking out because, again, running usually means danger. So we would start freaking out too. And then we have competing. So competing is when members tend to exhibit opposite patterns. So if someone was slouching in their chair in a meeting, someone else might compete with that person by sitting up straight to show that there's a difference between the person sitting up straight and the person slouching. Okay, that's another way of nonverbal communication in a group setting. And then nonverbal communication is always continuous. It's not discrete. So verbal communication, it's not continuous. Nonverbal communication is continuous. You're always going to have your face. And if the other person you're talking to is able to see you, then that is continuous. Okay. But even then, even if they can't see your face, if they can hear your tone, that's nonverbal communication, right? So it is continuous. It's not discrete. There's not a clear ending and starting point. And just like verbal communication, nonverbal communication has ambiguity. Okay. Me, like I gave you an example at the beginning. If I was looking at you and we were talking and we were having this really cool, fun conversation, and then all of a sudden I go like this, what would you feel? You would probably say to yourself, oh, am I boring them? Am I boring you? Or you might be like, why the heck are they making that face? Right. So it's ambiguous. This could just be that I temporarily got tired, or I'm so infatuated with what you're saying that I'm just looking at you in awe. It has so many different meanings, and you can't just assume those meanings, right? So let's do some examples. If you saw this next picture, what would you think? You would probably think this is a stop sign, right? It's a symbol and it has a message on it. language that's being used here. There's colors, there's nonverbal communication. The red is telling us, stop, alert, right? The word is saying stop. We know what stop means in the English language, right? And we know that shape. That shape is commonly referred to as a stop sign, even though it's a one, two, three, it's a hexagon. I, I'm not a math person. It's a hexagon. So we all got that, right? Because most of us are from here or know the stop sign or know the word stop, right? Or most of us probably drive too. Okay. So because of all those cultural meanings that we have together, we're able to come to the conclusion that this means stop. Okay. But if we changed it to just this, what does this tell you? Some of you, when you first saw this, you probably thought it's a stop sign, but there's no wording on it. So is it a stop sign or is it just a red hexagon? Which one is it? For foreigners, it might just be a red hexagon. For Americans, it is still a stop sign, but missing the word stop. Okay. Now, this one's going to really throw you for a doozy. A green hexagon. But that's really weird, right? That's abnormal for us to see a green hexagon. Okay. But my point is, and I hope you got the point, but just in case you didn't, verbal and nonverbal communication, they're both ambiguous. Nonverbal more so, but there's more things and we need to do to make sure we're understanding someone, especially in a group setting. So making sure that our group communication is clear and effective is why we have small group meetings, why we have group projects, why we have group communication, because we're able to come together and come up with a similar idea of what things mean in an effective manner. Okay. Next, we're going to watch this video where this individual is this is Dr. Leon. He has a great YouTube channel. I'm going to be using a lot of clips from his YouTube when he's helping us define and go over topics in communication studies. Okay, so let's go ahead and watch this.
What is communication? We're going to give our best effort to answer that. And we have to admit that defining communication in a way that everybody agrees with is almost impossible. Why? Well, one reason is because the word is so common. In 1970, in the Journal of Communication, Frank Dance said that communication is one of the most overworked terms in the English language. And he wrote that decades ago, but the situation is really the same today. It's a word like culture or community. If you asked 100 different people what those words mean, you'd get 100 different definitions. But we have to try to define it. I'm no quitter. So here's what we're going to do. This video has 3 parts. First, I'm going to give you a basic definition. Next, we'll look at 3 popular models of communication over time. And finally, I'll touch on how different researchers study communication from different angles. Taken together, that will give you a well-rounded answer to this question. The word communication in Latin comes from communicare, which means to share, to make something common. And I love that. My plain language, basic working definition of communication from all I've read is the process by which people transmit information, share verbal and nonverbal messages, and create meaning with each other. So let's look at 3 popular communication models that align with those 3 keywords: transmit, share, and create. First, some people think communication is about how we transmit information. Years ago, in 1948, Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver developed a foundational model of communication that you'll see in most textbooks. From their view, communication happens when an information source, a sender, has a message and transmits that message in the form of a signal through a channel. Let's say that little box in the middle represents the channel. Then that signal is received by the receiver at its final destination. Along the way, there might be some noise in the communication system that could negatively influence the process. Some people call this the container model because, according to the model, meaning is contained in the words themselves. When the message has then reached its final destination, communication has been accomplished because the message has been sent and received. Now, I'd like to point out that the concept of feedback is not part of Shannon and Weaver's original model, even though some textbooks add that. The word feedback does not appear in the diagram and nowhere in the text of the original article. That concept came later. Shannon and Weaver were diagramming and were interested in communication systems like the telegraph, the telephone, and radio. And their model reflects that 1948 way of looking at communication. So it's a linear, one-way model that describes how information is transmitted. Their model is very limited and not designed to explain face-to-face communication. And that's why most textbooks call this the information transfer model. So that's our first keyword, transmit. To some people, the answer to the question, what is communication, is that it is simply the transmitting of information. Our next keyword is share. Some people think communication is about sharing meaning. Fast forward several decades and a couple of models to 1962, Dean Barnlund articulated the transactional model of communication. To Barnlund, communication wasn't a one-way process. To him, it had a different nature. Communication was dynamic, continuous, and circular. In other words, communication between people is an ongoing, back and forth, simultaneous exchange. We are senders and receivers at the same time. And the point is, we exchange messages because we want to share meaning with other people. Barnlund's model includes both verbal and nonverbal cues and feedback. And importantly, to Barnlund, meaning existed within the person, not the words. So like Shannon and Weaver's 1948 model, the sender has a meaning that he or she wants to communicate and encodes it in specific words and then sends it. At that point, according to Shannon and Weaver's model, meaning exists in the words. But for Barnlund, that wasn't quite right. His transactional model says that the receiver interprets or decodes what those words mean for him or herself. Then that really highlights that meaning is not in the words, but meaning is in us. It's in our minds. We supply the meaning. We are superimposing our understanding or interpretation onto the process. And that's why two people can hear the same exact message, but interpret it differently. So to Barnlund, he looked so closely at the way communication happens face to face, and he looked at some of these subtle processes that were happening to explain this process more thoroughly. So while Shannon and Weaver's model is about transmitting messages, the transactional model describes the complex and layered process we follow to pursue and achieve shared meaning with each other. To Barnlund, it's all about the way individuals collaboratively work toward shared meaning through communication. So Barnlund's answer to the question about what is communication is it's the process through which we achieve shared meaning. Our next keyword is create. So let's leap forward a couple of more decades and talk about how communication is the generative process that creates our social world. And to me, this is where it gets really interesting. According to this approach, the word communication describes the way we create meaning in the first place. Robert Craig says communication constitutes our social reality. Constitute means create. He said in his 1999 article, communication is not a secondary phenomenon. Communication doesn't happen after those views are already in our head, after culture has taught us norms, after socioeconomic factors have shaped us. Craig says that communication is the primary constitutive social process that explains all these other factors. So I'll put that in my own words. Compared to the previous mentioned models, pre-existing meaning is not in the words. Meaning is not even in our minds that we then communicate. We're not simply sharing already existing ideas. When we communicate with each other, according to this view, in our conversations, we are generating those ideas together. We create meaning through our interactions with others over time. We create our social world together that we could have not created on our own. The creation of shared meaning is a collective accomplishment. Our whole social reality is the product, the outcome of communication. So communication is that driving creative force at the center of our sense of self, our relationships, our families, our culture. Through interactions, we make or break agreements. We create or dissolve relationships. We form the tone or nature of those relationships. We establish societal norms or violate them through the process of communication. So it might seem on the surface that meaning exists in words or even in our heads, but to Robert Craig and others who follow this constitutive approach, we have to remember that we are not dealing with already existing meanings provided by nature. That meaning was first and foremost generated and is still being generated through our communication processes. So the answer to the question, what is communication, from this point of view, is that it's a creative process, a meaning generating process. Man, we've already covered a lot of ground by looking at these three models, but let's finally touch on some major areas that show how people look at communication that will help us to make it even more concrete. The most historic area is rhetoric. If you've ever taken a public speaking class, then you have an idea about what this is. It all began when Aristotle wrote a book about 2,000 years ago, and even really before that. And he taught us that when we spoke, we had these available approaches and choices and techniques that we could use to persuade our listeners. The classic view of rhetoric is all about how a speaker can create and share messages artfully with an audience for maximum persuasiveness. Aristotle showed us that there are dozens or maybe even hundreds of small choices that we make along the way that can make us more or less persuasive given the circumstances. Today, the area of rhetoric studies things like political speeches, argumentation, the freedom of expression in society, and lots of other topics like that. Another popular area is called interpersonal communication. This area looks at one-on-one conversations and relationships and normally focuses on face-to-face interaction, like friendships, romantic relationships, and family dynamics. At a basic level, you might study things like active listening skills, conflict resolution, the stages of relationship development. The area of interpersonal communication is a big area of study. It looks at both nonverbal and verbal dynamics and how small changes in the way we talk to each other can shape our relationships in big ways. Another popular area is organizational communication. This is another broad area. Here you'd learn about communication that happens in and around the workplace. You might study, for example, different leadership styles and how you see those at work, or workplace culture and how it shapes our lives as employees, and how communication is likely to happen through both formal and informal networks. Organizational communication is a huge area, and we even see subfields within it taking shape on their own, like crisis communication, training and development, and whole classes in professional communication skills. More recently, we see a lot of interest in the area of health communication. And here you'd learn about how communication in healthcare settings is really important because it can directly impact issues like how quickly patients recover, how we communicate risk, and how patients and families talk about illness in either helpful or harmful ways. It's all about the way the quality of communication influences our health and well-being. And I'm just scratching the surface. Communication is a huge field. And there's lots of other interesting areas of study. And it seems like the boundaries continue to expand every day. And like I said from the beginning, finding one agreed upon definition of communication is not really the goal. But we have to at least explore a basic definition, look at these three common models, and mention some of the major areas of study to help us answer the question. Hopefully, this will paint a well-rounded picture that answers the question, what is communication? So, question for you, how would you answer this question? I would love to hear your comments in that section below the video, and I look forward to reading your point of view. And by the way, I have a free online mini course in the 5 essential communication skills that every professional should know. I will put a link to that in the description below this video. Feel free to take a look. It's free. Thanks, God bless, and I will see you in the next video.
Okay. So I hope you enjoyed that video. It kind of summarized a lot of the things that we spoke about already. But what it also did was allowed for a beautiful segue into our next topic, which is not lecture, it's about your group presentations. So I know that you all probably have seen it by the point or by the time that this lecture is being recorded, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page on what I'm looking for your group presentation. So here, let me stop my share. And then let me move over to this other screen. Share, okay, log in. Okay, so group presentation. Okay, so this is what we're looking at when we talk about the group presentation. So for you all, it's again, these instructions were specifically made for the online format. So this one should be specific to you all. So what I'm really looking for is for you as a group to come together to create a 10-minute presentation where you teach others in your class in this class about different, we'll get into the topics in a minute, but you're basically teaching the class about something, okay? And you're gonna get your topics in a minute. So you and your group are going to create a 10-minute presentation where you're going to go over this topic, a topic that you'll get in a minute. The requirements are 10 minutes long in groups of 3, which I will formulate for you. You should have an attention getter. So in communication studies, but also in presentations in general and speeches, you should always try to grab your audience's attention. As this is a group communication course, I'm really looking for that effective communication. And the effective communication is going to come through when I can see that there's some smooth transitions to the next speaker and also enough material to get through 10 minutes of presenting. I'm not interested in how well you speak per se. This is not a public speaking course. I'm really looking at the interconnectedness of the group and how you guys present as a team. There are 6 different elements for the group presentation. First off, group meetings. So you and your group will have to meet twice throughout the semester. And this is at least twice, meaning you could and technically should meet more than twice. But I need proof that you guys met, which means a Zoom recording of your session or audio recording if you guys wanted to meet up in person. So either way, but I need a recording of some sort. And when we get closer to the deadline for the first group meeting, that will be in Canvas for you all to submit. And we just need one person from the group to submit it. Okay. It's 60 points. So it's a lot of points. Your presentation itself is only 80 points. So the group meetings are super important. Your first group meeting has to be completed before February 20th. So that's coming up. So you guys will get your groups this week. You guys should publish that and put it in the Canvas shelf by February 20th. This is not listed in the syllabus for a reason because I want you to be aware and attentive to the deadlines that are set in this document. Okay. Your second group meeting should be completed before April 17th. So again, the presentations are not due until the end of the semester. So you should have no issue getting your second group meeting video, Zoom meeting, or audio message published in Canvas by April 17th. You are required to check in. Everyone in the group is. It'll be on one Zoom meeting. You should email me before April 30th, or sorry, April 3rd to have this check-in with me. This is a way for me to make sure that everything is going okay / smoothly and to see if there are any course adjustments that are needed with your group. So if something's not working out in your group, I need to know that. And hopefully you would have told me before the check-in, but the check-in is my last time to check in with you as a group to make sure that you're on track. Your group evaluation, this is evaluation is individual evaluation, so it will only be read by me, and it should be this should be an assignment or a write-up where you let me know of any conflicts that arose during the presentation formation, if you wanted to highlight an amazing member in your group, or if you had any feedback for me as a professor. This evaluation is not a place where you gossip or leave rude comments about others in your group. The critique should be centered around being constructive, and these evaluations are due in Canvas the day that your group presents. Okay. Presentation, again, really looking just for 10 minutes of presenting. You can do whatever you want with the information on the topic, which we'll get into in a minute. On the day, or sorry, the week before you present, you have to provide me with a write-up. So write-up is basically you can either do a couple things. You can do a literal word format where you just talk about what you're going to do in each slide, or what I think you all should do is print out your slides and send it to me in an email and PDF format. So that way I can see exactly what I'll be expecting. Peer reviews are going to be a little bit different for this class. Basically, in that week, so I think it was week 12, it's the presentation start. In week 12, your discussion boards will turn into peer reviews for the group that presented that week. So that's why you need to give me your presentations on time that week so I can get it uploaded to the discussion board. Topic selection. Okay, so this is the part where you're probably wondering, well, what am I supposed to do it on? This is what you're supposed to do it on. So what I need you to do is send me an email with your top 5 sections here, subsections of communication that you would like to do your presentation on. So like other majors, if you're a psych major, you have subdisciplines. You have clinical psychology, you have forensic psychology, educational psychology. And if you're a computer science major, there's software engineering, artificial intelligence, data science, etc. Communication studies has the exact same thing. So we have lots, and this is only 10, but we have lots of different communication subdisciplines. And you're basically teaching the class about these other communication subdisciplines. Small group communication is a subdiscipline of communication studies. So I'm wanting you guys to do outside research and come up with a presentation where you explain and teach to the class what these subdisciplines are. And these are just small snippets of the different topics that you can choose. So remember, put your top 5 choices and email to me, and then you'll get an email from me with your group members so you guys can start planning. Okay? That does it for this week's lecture. I know that was a lot, and I will edit it to make sure it's nice and crisp and to the point. But that is week 2, week 1 lecture, and I'll see you guys next week.